Well, welcome, and what an honor to have you here. There's a lot of big themes to discuss, but I thought I'd start with asking you a very small question. You've all lived justice, worked on justice in many different ways in your careers, and I was wondering if you could give us one example of a specific instance in which you saw justice done, where you thought, here today is a moment where I see justice done. Is that something, Dr. Albright, that I could ask you to reflect on?
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here, and Your Royal Highness, it's wonderful to see you again, and Mr. Mayor, and everybody here, and fellow panelists. I have to say, I take great satisfaction in something that the Deputy Prime Minister mentioned, is the arrival of Ratko Mladic here. That is justice done. It is in the process of being taken care of, but if I might take the opportunity to answer this question in this way, one of the first votes I took as United States representative to the United Nations was to create the War Crimes Tribunal. And people didn't think it would happen. They didn't believe that such a tribunal could take place. They didn't think we'd ever find any judges. They didn't think that we would ever develop any kind of a system for it. We didn't think that there would be any people that were turned over to the War Crimes Tribunal. We didn't think that there would be any indictments. We didn't think there would be any trials, and we didn't think anybody would be sentenced. And all those things have happened. And the moment of justice, Ratko Mladic, Karadzic is also an example of it, that it really has worked. I take, I suppose one shouldn't, but I take special pleasure in it. And I also
I think
feel
you're not alone if I listen to the audience.
Very much in some way as, and I've been called this, the mother of the War Crimes Tribunal. I was able to come to The Hague to help when the building was chosen for it. I testified in the Plavšič trial, and I have been very much a part of it, and I do think that is a moment of justice, and we will watch it unfold.
Yes. Well, thank you very much. Let's get back to this when we discuss the first item of the Institute's agenda, the judiciary. But first, I would like to turn to you, Dr. Hossain. Do you have one moment in your long and distinguished career where you thought, here is justice done?
Yes, I think my example would be South Africa and the end of apartheid, because I was part of a UN tribunal which took evidence in Geneva from a cross-section of people business world, people from academia, people from churches, from South Africa, people from political parties, all of whom said that the time has now come when apartheid must end. So we made a set of recommendations. Have meaningful negotiations, release President Mandela, who was to become President Mandela, hold elections, and let the new South Africa be born. And it was very gratifying when I was there for a month, when the elections were held, and we who went as Commonwealth observers, the Commonwealth Secretary General is here, and I was privileged to go as part of the Commonwealth observer team, and we were given a special responsibility to assist all the elderly voters who were voting for the first time in their life. It was so moving to see someone coming in a wheelchair with handshaking, and we were permitted to assist. And he'd say, Mandela, and you would point out where the photograph was, and with a shaking hand and with tears in his eyes, the person would put his X against the name of Mandela. And so we really saw the new South Africa being born, and it was an achievement of long years of struggle, the suffering of President Mandela and his colleagues, and the way the international community ultimately were able to help in holding those elections, in following through with the establishment of the institutions of democracy, and to see a long struggle. I remember as an undergraduate, I had thought that apartheid is one of the things that will never end. The irresistible force which was behind it would not yield to the demands of justice, but one saw the demands of justice prevail.
So impunity, apartheid, those big systematic things that would never end, and then the moments that one sees that a crack or even a hole whole has been made. I think we will get back to this theme as well as we discuss the second item on the Institute's agenda, peace, diplomacy, international relations. South Africa, of course, is one instance of a country where the law played such an important role also in the transition to democracy. But first, let me invite Professor Fresco to reflect on a moment in your career, spanning all these countries, working on sustainability, where you thought this is where I see justice done.
Yes, let me offer quite a different type of example. Very early on in my career, I worked in what was then Zaire, still under Mobutu, a country torn by civil war, as unfortunately it still is today, a country where I think people were and are among the poorest in the world. And in that country, I worked on something very simple and practical, because I'm by training not at all a lawyer, but an agronomist. I worked on the food crop of the poor, cassava. And it was impossible, because of diseases in the crop, to actually get access to new planting material. People were actually dying. This was also the beginning of the then unknown HIV/AIDS epidemic. So the situation was really terrible. And I was struggling to get new planting material to these poor women. It's very much a women's crop. I couldn't do anything, not anything serious. But 30 years later, as the person in charge of the negotiations on the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources, I finally saw, after 12 years of negotiations, how we managed to get a treaty on access and benefit sharing in the area of plant genetic resources that would recognize the rights of people, particularly of poor people, both the farmers who had developed the crops and those who needed them most, to have access and to share and benefit from those crops, from the genetic material which really is the heritage of mankind. And I must say that moment of the ultimate vote in the then General Assembly of the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, where we were very, very fearful that some key countries, including the US, would vote against this particular treaty. When it finally came, and we had no votes against and only 2 abstentions, I think was a real moment of elation. I thought, this is what I've done it for. This is why we went through 12 years of negotiations for these poor women farmers in Africa.
So, well, thank you very much for a moving example, and also for pointing out the interrelationship between global law, global justice, these negotiations, and what happens somewhere in what today is the DRC. And also for neatly fitting into the third theme of the Institute, sustainability, and the emphasis on distributive justice and socio-economic rights as a theme closely related to any true justice. Returning to the war crimes that were never thought to happen and that now have taken on such a flight and today are in full swing all around us. An enormous amount has happened, an enormous amount of challenges are still lying there. The Institute wants to focus on, for instance, the efficiency, the question as to what works in the judiciary in general, but also in terms of international justice. Could I ask you, Dr. Albright, what are your ideas on this topic?
Well, first of all, I'm not a lawyer, and I no
this
longer...
is why I ask you.
Yes, and I'm no longer a diplomat, as will become very clear.
That's another reason to ask you.
I think that what we have said is that the mill of justice grinds exceedingly slowly, but it does grind. And I think that that is a very important aspect of it. Partially, when you are dealing with international justice, you obviously are dealing with very many aspects of it. I have to tell you, my first experience with international law was when I was in college doing a moot case. I was the Chief Justice in the Iceland fisheries case, I thought. So I got very interested even at that stage. But I think that watching how long it does take, first of all, to establish the principles, which is why I think the Institute is going to be so important, because we have different legal systems. How you match a common law system with a civil system, and how you figure out what are the rules by which the system operates. Then trying to get the prosecutors and the judges. One of the things that I did when I was at the United Nations was also to gather the group of women permanent representatives. I thought it would be a very large group. At that stage, there were 183 countries. There were 7 of us, women. We called ourselves the G7, and what we managed to do was to get to 2 women judges on the first War Crimes Tribunal, because in fact many of the cases were cases against women, and then getting rape declared a weapon of war. But it takes a very long time. The other part and it's not particularly, I have to say, it takes a while in order to assemble all the aspects. The other part that takes a while that we have seen most recently is the difficulty of capturing the people. I think that is really, so you not only have to have the peaceful elements of your system, but also you have to have the capability, especially in these kinds of cases, to get the people to The Hague.
And there's
or to
the
Arusha.
Input side, and then in terms of impact, effectiveness, the kind of knowledge that the Institute seeks to develop in terms of what works in political science. Now increasingly you have research on what transitional justice mechanisms truly contribute to democracy and peace. Where would you say the challenges there lie in terms of...
I would very much like to add a 4th D, Mr. Dean. Democracy needs to be added to that. It is development, diplomacy, defense, and democracy. And I do think that democracy requires law. And it requires the regularity of law. It's the arbitrariness that distinguishes democracy from totalitarian or authoritarian governments. And so being able to have the rule of law, trying to make sure that you have trained judges, that there is a code, a system whereby people know what they are supposed to abide by. And various, if I might kind of link to what was just said, the aspect also of people being able to own something legally. I was part of a process with a well-known Peruvian economist, Hernando de Soto, who believes that poor people can be part of their economy if they actually have title to the land, that piece of paper, the title to the land, in order to show that they own it.
And that's very exciting, because we speak about international tribunals, but global justice is actually, as I understand it, very much also about local justice, about seeing justice done in different ways in different places. And you, over the past decade, invested an enormous amount of effort into legal empowerment.
It's the legal empowerment of the poor.
Yes.
And access to justice. And we talked about property rights. By the way, Hernando loved what Larry Summers said, which was nobody ever washes a rented car, which means that people do not take care of the land if they don't really own it. And so, and then we had business rights, labor rights, and access to justice. For out of 8 billion or 7 billion people in the world, there may be like 5 billion that have no access to justice. And so that is very much a part of democracy.
Yeah, and a part of the Institute's agenda. A final question on the strides made, because we spoke about war tribunals, but you've lived you were there during Rwanda. You were at the United Nations as an ambassador. You were in office at the time of Kosovo. You've lived through the whole development of thinking on humanitarian intervention, the rise of the notion of the idea of the responsibility to protect, that there is a world community which at times has to step in terms of mass human rights violations. How do you these days look at the discussions on Libya and Syria?
Okay. First of all, I think I was at the UN, I think, at a very interesting time. At the beginning of the 90s, after the freeze of the Cold War, when the UN really began to look at how it could take care of the responsibilities that had been set up when the founders started it in 45. And peacekeeping operations began to evolve. There had existed peacekeeping operations, but more broadly, that would actually get more involved in what were regarded as internal fights. There were lots of questions about whether that was appropriate or not. And then who participates in them and what are the responsibilities of the international community towards human security. And why do we interfere in the internal affairs of other countries? And I think that what has really happened is, as a result of increased information, I think we know everything that's going on inside every country. There are arguments, I would not be one to make them, that people did not know what was going on during World War II. We now know everything. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the question is, if you know it, and there is some mechanism for dealing with crimes against humanity or to prevent genocide, that we have a responsibility to do that. I was asked recently by the U.S. Institute of Peace to do a task force on the prevention of genocide and how one does that in terms of warning signals, how the diplomatic community works on trigger mechanisms to understand. Mm-hmm. And we were talking earlier about the importance of doing conflict resolution before people start killing each other. And now I've been asked actually to do a task force on the responsibility to protect. It is a fascinating doctrine. It is a part of the United Nations. But who does it and how? Yeah. And when is responsibility to protect actually aggression into somebody's country? The Security Council Resolution 1973, which has an element of the responsibility to protect within it, is a very interesting example. And the question of who carries it out, in this case NATO, is it appropriate? Yeah. One of the issues that is really, really hard is that I believe that it's important to have moral foreign policies with consistency of principle, but unfortunately, as a former practitioner, you become pragmatic and you can't do everything everywhere. And so I think that one of the things that will be for the Institute to look at is what are the kind of the rules about all this, and then to have people that are a part of it who can in fact say, okay, we can do something here, but we can't do something there. And to put it back into a law discussion is, just because you can't catch every burglar, does it mean you don't catch the ones that you can? Yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful thing. And the tension between principles and pragmatism, and that's also the hard tension, and the need to draw on practice, on practical experience, as can be done here in The Hague for the Institute. Well, you, as the other panelists, Dr. Hossain, you straddle practical experience, knowledge. You've worked in all these fields. One of the exciting, I think, items on the agenda of the Institute is peace diplomacy, peace building, weaving human rights, the rule of law into process of peace building, making sure that principles don't disappear when practice comes around. In your long experience, what do you look back at as a particular successful example of peace negotiations where law and peace building did meet? It's a big question, and
It's a big question, and this is where I think this institute will have a very creative and productive role to play, because, you know, what can we learn from our past experience? We can look back at the experience where attempts at preventing conflict succeeded. Attempts which you didn't succeed, you can learn from failures as well. Why did we not? You know, the experience of Rwanda, we all now recognize that, you know, that was somewhere General Delaire's evidence and so on. That in future, timely intervention must be needed. That was one of the UN's admitted failures. But from all of these, we need to look at them in order to anticipate the future. Yeah. And for this, you really needed this institute. It's a response to the felt need all over the world. Yeah. And I'm very happy, and I congratulate the founders for responding to a global need. And the minister also, I found, showed that response sensitivity to a felt need all over the world. You know, 193 states, if you were to take a head count, all of them would say we need it. Yeah. We need to learn from the past experience so that we don't repeat the same mistakes in future. We can anticipate, see the early warning signs, and have the right to, or the duty to protect could be invoked. So this is where imaginative studies, listening to voices which have not been heard. There are victims of violations of human rights, victims of gender inequality, victims of poverty, victims of different types of injustice scattered all over the world. Their voices need to be heard. I think that is a kind of research that is urgently needed.
And if you would have to, if they would give you an office at the Institute and they would say, ask you, Dr. Hossain, write down one case study, share one case with us where this was successfully or maybe not successfully heard, where we didn't listen to the right voices, or we did at the time, what experience would you, as one of the practitioners that the...
You see, the part success, but you know, it's a continuing challenge is Afghanistan. That is something, Madam Secretary also has been deeply engaged in the problems of Afghanistan. She's seen the refugees in the refugee camps. 6 million of them. I came at a point where there were 6 million. There are still 4 million of them who've been refugees for 20 to 30 years. And little kids who've been born in a refugee camp are now 20 years old. I remember seeing a little girl, it must be 15 years ago. I mean, she must be now a full-grown, woman. And they're still in refugee camps. But where I said we made some progress was, after 9/11, there was a very decisive intervention. And it fell to my lot to make the first report. I went through minefields 2 or 3 days after this, the coalition effort started. And I was among those who were able to say that, yes, the people in Kabul felt that this was welcome. The fact that they were being liberated from the kind of oppression that they'd been subject to. Women teachers had not been able to teach. You know, the 80% of school teachers in Kabul were women. They had been told to go home and not to teach. So they were able to come back, resume their life. And so this was a success. The fact that, the process had begun of Afghanistan being restored to its people. And the refugees that I went in the camps, they said, when can we go back? We're keen to go back. And about 1 to 2 million came back. But then the process stopped. And this is what we have to learn from why something which could have been a tremendous success. Vice President Biden, I heard him speak on an occasion, and his speech was entitled, Afghanistan Squandered Opportunities. And I went up and shook his hand. And I said, this was when he was just Senator Biden, not Vice President. And I said, you've just got it right, because seeing this thing on the ground, I do feel this is such great opportunities to allow 4 million people to come back home after 20 years. It's a devastated country, irrigation systems blown up, infrastructure destroyed. Other communities have been, sort of scattered. So among the recommendations we have made, and this is where I think the Bonn Agreement was made in Bonn, giving a framework, the human rights framework in which the community should be rebuilt so people could go back and live as human beings, enjoying their rights. Women would, and the women were particularly vocal in the urge to go back, saying that, we have suffered enormously under these years. We are very keen to go back and build our country. And I have said that this is, as Secretary Albright has always said, think of non-state actors. Yes, we know there's a transitional government, and we played a part in getting the king who was in exile in Rome. I went and saw him. He came back, convened an assembly, and a transitional government was set up. So that is going on. And we saw a photograph in the video, President Karzai, and I met him on the first day. He assumed power with a lot of hope. But, we'll have to, and I think President Obama, in a very major policy speech, took note of the fact that, yes, where there had been lapses, resources had not been got. So that is one thing. But the real part
and
where I feel,
the non-state actors. The
non-state actors, that is where I say, I think,
point.
Madam Secretary gets it absolutely right. All of these people who've been out of the country have seen the world outside and know that how you can build another society where people can enjoy freedom, people can enjoy human rights, women can enjoy a measure of equality which they've never known before, and communities should be participating. They should be not only building roads and houses, but rebuilding communities. And not just a top-down, but again, the ownership, what the Secretary always says, all the people together must rebuild their own country and you know, make it their own project.
And there, justice is not only the prerogative of states, of courts, but very much of all actors involved, NGOs obviously, but also corporate actors. And I suppose in the field of socio-economic justice, distributive justice, questions concerning sustainability, that's more clear than anywhere else. I personally think it's wonderful that this issue of development and sustainability is so explicitly part of the Institute's agenda. How do you, as a person coming very much from and working on sustainability for the past decades, how do you see the challenges lying in practically linking sustainability to justice, be it global or be it in a village in
I think indeed we are in a very exciting and unique time where for the first time there is real awareness at all levels that sustainability, whatever way we define it exactly, I mean sustainability is like love, we all know more or less what it is about, but nobody can define it. But in any case, however we define it, I think there's really true agreement that there is something like transgenerational and cross-boundary responsibility in a world of scarce resources with increasing population. And even if population growth is declining and we may stabilize the population, our demands on the world's resources will continue. And the real question is, how can we do justice to those in need so that they can share some of those resources? And it poses a number of very interesting questions. First of all, it poses questions at the global level. Does the use of resources, clean air, water, land, by some actually deduct from the resources by others? Is it indeed so that the emissions of CO2 by some of the risk countries actually limit the possibilities for development of others? That's one type of situations. Or can we find ways in which we can truly find a win-win situation where the growth for some will also help the growth of others? And that's particularly, for example, the case that I quoted just before on genetic resources, having open access to, in this case, genetic resources or resources for production will really benefit all.
And what is now, if I may ask on that topic, what is the role of a regulatory framework, emphasis on rights, the right to food, the right to development, in this kind of thinking? Do you see that role there, or?
Yes, I do, and I think we should start at or at least we should consider this also definitely at the global level. We have the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals. They are being reassessed. There are some very important aspects. Actually, all of them touch upon justice. And of course, we have the Rio +20, the 20 years after the Earth Summit Rio next year in Rio de Janeiro. And I think this will be really the moment to take stock of where we are on development issues and where justice links to development. And I would really make a plea for the Institute to be present in Rio and look at how we can promote the issue of justice when it comes to the use of resources. But this also applies at country level. And I think one of the things we could do is see how some of these regulatory frameworks that are now in existence or are evolving, indeed the post-Kyoto world, indeed a plant genetic resources world, but the whole issue of energy is still unresolved, how those kinds of frameworks can actually have a meaning at national level, and how the responsibility of the rich countries versus particularly the poorest economies can be exercised within a legal framework.
And how to democratically develop these frameworks, how to come up with an international architecture with a way of decision making that actually allows for the voices that Mr. Hossain speaks about to be built in international decision making. I mean, you have the experience at the FAO. Could you say something about that topic?
The most difficult thing, I think, for all of us is to make the voices of those who cannot speak, make them heard. Because they have no legal means, they have no voice, no channel to express themselves. So the challenge is to find ways to access them. And maybe there need to be really innovative ways to do this. One thing we haven't really mentioned, but there is, of course, in many of the most isolated areas of the world where governments do not exist, often the private sector exists. It's always amazing to me. You come to the most isolated parts of Africa, and lo and behold, you find soft drinks out of nowhere. So somehow there is a distribution channel there. And maybe we should use these channels that exist in a far more creative way to make voices heard. And I think technology is on our side. I am really excited when I go to isolated places and I see people now, farmers, poorest farmers who are hardly literate, accessing world market prices for their grains on a mobile phone in Africa. And I think there's an enormous way to promote democracy and justice hand in hand at those kinds of levels. But what we need to do is to find clear themes where this can be accessed, because it's not easy to say, for example, take the right to food. I mean, there has been a lot of negotiations on the right to food. We also know that many governments are hesitant to implement something like the right to food because they're worried that their citizens may take the government to court. How do you actually define and measure and enforce the right to food? So we shouldn't be complacent about these issues, but I think the going hand in hand of the international justice, interest that we have in the world with these sustainability issues promotes an enormously strong interaction and synergy that we, in my view, have never had before. So we should take that opportunity, and the Institute should really make something out of that.
Yeah, and I think the Institute's widening in terms of interdisciplinary perspectives, the combination of the global-local perspective, that is really fascinating. One of the words that I missed in the program, and that to me seems such a crucial issue in thinking about global justice, is the L word, legitimacy. In thinking about these international tribunals, going to a next step, in thinking about the building of international law, how to ensure the legitimacy of what takes place. You've already partially given the answer, but Dr. Albright, would you like to comment on that issue?
I think you asked me earlier about why things take so long, and partially it is you have to do it, and then it has to get established as something that is a good thing to do, and then to get the legitimacy. In systems where, frankly, some of us have come here for a discussion of former foreign ministers to talk about we are in a strange period where there's not that much faith in a variety of institutions, both local, national, and international, and it has to do with legitimacy and who speaks for whom. I think that it is, but it's hard, and I think that when you bring in, for instance, the non-state actor that is a corporation, let's talk about a soft drink place. They use local water. And so the question is, what responsibilities do they have? I was looking at one of the activities of the Institute is about natural resources. Certainly, the things that are going to go on over water are going to make fights over oil seem minor. And the bottom line is that the Institute, I think, has a very good opportunity to kind of lay the groundwork for trying to figure out how to avoid the water fights or the issues on food security. It's not just the right to have food, it's the capability of growing the food on land that somebody has bought without asking permission, or common lands. I mean, they're just endless series of issues. And I think it would be interesting in looking at the themes of the Institute to also take a big case study, let's say food security, for instance, which in fact has a peace building activity to it because people will argue over who owns the land, the non-state actor aspect, the distributive aspect, the sustainable environmental aspects, and by having these different themes of being, I'm a great advocate of interdisciplinary approaches to issues, and I think that the Institute provides a great vehicle for that. But the legitimacy of the decision is the hardest part, because let's take the War Crimes Tribunal back again. This was created by a United Nations resolution, but it takes a while to make it agreed to that X person whom we happen to know murdered a lot of people, but that the truth is that the War Crimes Tribunal is the appropriate place for him to be taken to. So it takes a while, and I think the Institute is going to have a long life, that is going to be able to look at these issues in the larger aspect.
Yeah, and in that sense, legitimacy is a process, also to be studied as a process and to be studied from different perspectives. Dr. Hossain, we're on the topic of the already quite full agenda of the Institute, I think quite fruitfully in the Netherlands, also in looking at the right to water as a central concern also of the Dutch state. In looking at the Institute's agenda, from your academic and your practical experience, do you have issues where you say, well, it's absolutely crucial to use all the knowledge that there is here in The Hague on that particular topic, because that's where global justice should be concretized in the years to come?
Right, but I think already we've mentioned the role of law now must address those things which touch people's legitimate expectations. Mm-hmm. You know, if you hear the voices of people and say, what do you consider to be your basic entitlements and expectations, you will find people will articulate that, will tell you that. But then it is for those who devise a strategy of how their expectations can be realized through conscious policies, through community action, through people responding in a constructive way to those challenges. Now, you know, we have in the past, the population resources ratio had been more favorable than it will be as we move on. The population in the world is continuing to increase. Before we know it, will be 8 billion people in the world, and with the same resources and the same land and the same water. Mm-hmm. So as Madam Secretary says, not only is oil expected to deplete, hydrocarbons are expected to deplete by the middle of the century, but water is going to be, the projection is that water may be the source of conflict and tremendous competing claims being made. And this is where, of course, the other important thing which I think we should keep in view is power, whether power can then be used in a way that the powerful can exclude the powerless. And certainly even in cases of uses of water, this recent floods in Pakistan, people were saying that the powerful were able to keep the waters for themselves, and this was having very adverse impacts on the less powerful. So law has a means of limiting power, limiting arbitrariness. And that's why the rule of law is so important in the economic sphere. For sustainable development is something which would ensure intergenerational fairness, so that our generation doesn't consume disproportionately more, so that future generations are not deprived. So these notions of fairness need to be reflected now, both in the making of law, in the application of law, in the making of policy. And although, you know, we are all for free economies, free market, but one of the lessons learned from this recent experience is that even free markets, where they have market failures and lapses, need to be regulated by proper regulation, not a heavy-handed regulation. I remember Professor Stiglitz saying, it's not regulation or no regulation, it must be sound regulation, not bureaucratic, heavy-handed regulation, but something which requires expertise and understanding. Again, I can see The Hague has great importance. You have strength in financial institutions and financial matters. And so creative inputs can now be expected from a multidisciplinary institute set in The Hague, drawing upon all the intellectual and professional resources of Europe and, you know, North America and everywhere else. Mm-hmm. I think it's absolutely the right moment.
Global regulations, global laws drawn up by a world community, in a way. I know you speak many languages, but I don't think you speak Dutch, but behind us, the last part, I think it's the 1813 Constitution, it says, well, to have any right here, one should be Dutch. And I was just thinking what we're talking about very much here is the need for human rights and solutions also drawn up in the world context. And I think Professor van Vollenhoven referred to earlier, who spent half of his career working on traditional customary systems in Indonesia, and the other half arguing for the importance of international law, I think symbolizes the exchange of knowledge needed for that. As a final question, I would like to ask all our panelists, where should we be with this institute and hopefully also with the world in 2020? What should the aim in terms of truly working on global justice, going from war crimes being an illusion to a helicopter in The Hague? What are the new helicopters to land in 2020? Let me ask Professor Fresco first.
Well, I wouldn't dare to say anything about war tribunals, but what I do think is that probably the most important challenge is to provide a legal framework for making sure we use our world's resources in the best possible way, in the best way to meet the needs of all, in a fair way indeed. And the real question, I think, which is not resolved in my view, is to what extent we need legal frameworks, to what extent we can use other existing frameworks, and how the balance between the two is. Because I know from experience, just getting some of these treaties negotiated, and I mean, Kyoto is a case in point, may be an extremely lengthy process. And so the real question, I was very glad my panelists brought up the issue of the markets and market regulation. There are a couple of things that maybe we can do within a broad general framework where we only need the legal framework to make sure we correct the imperfections. And that balance between what needs to be a legal framework, or put differently, to what extent justice is far broader than just legal, and how it relates to the different resources of our earth is very important. Because, to give you just one example, water...
Well, let me just with an eye on, because I see this as the beginning of a conversation that will continue in the coming years. I'm looking at the time, and I have been prompted to be prompted. But I wouldn't like to miss the occasion to just in one final sentence have Dr. Hossain and your vision for 2020.
Well, I think for 2020 we should be setting our priorities in those areas where I think ending poverty to the extent possible, securing food security, and then, of course, energy, I suppose, in that kind of order.
Yeah, natural resources. Well, and we have just learned that these dreams sometimes do not stay dreams, but really become realities through sustained efforts. Dr. Albright.
Well, I think that what the Institute has to do is to do two things that seem contradictory. One is to create a framework that has some legitimacy and continuity, and at the same time maintain enough flexibility to be able to deal with the problems of 2020, which frankly I don't think we know what they will be. And that is the hardest part, is that everything is moving at such warp speed. You know, some of us think we're really advanced now because we're talking about water. It's probably something else. And the bottom line is to try to figure out how we integrate the knowledge that comes from people that know how to operate a system, but also understand how many more players there are in all of this. 8 billion people with different historical backgrounds and culture who have as much right to be heard as anybody else. And so I think the Institute has to have a framework of action, but flexibility and imagination and innovation, that those things all have to go together.
Well, thank you very much for these wise words. Thank you, the panelists, for setting out not only the agenda, but I think also the need for the Institute here in The Hague with its interdisciplinary agenda. Thank you so much.
Thank you.